Greetings, gentle viewers. Before we begin, a quick question for you. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea who they were really talking to? Keep that feeling close, because tonight's story is going to test it. If this is your first time here, welcome to the fireside. Subscribe now, ring the little bell, and settle in, because where we are going, you will not want to miss a single chapter. Here is where our story begins. A grand hall in the English countryside, the year 1817. Marble floors polished until they gleamed like still water. Candlelight dripping gold across the walls. 200 of the wealthiest families in the county gathered under one roof to celebrate the engagement of Duke Percival Ashford to Lady Beatrice Wren, an heiress whose fortune would finish paying off debts the Duke prayed no one would ever discover. And in the shadow of a marble pillar, half hidden from the crowd, stood a woman in a borrowed red gown that did not belong to her, and a name that no longer meant anything in this house. Her name was Genevieve Hartley. 6 years ago, she had been the daughter of a duke. Tonight, she was a servant girl who had been ordered to fetch wine and had wandered, for one foolish moment, too close to the dancing. She did not know that before the night ended, the very man mocking her would be on his knees in front of everyone he had ever tried to impress. Genevieve had learned, over 6 long years, exactly how to fade into the background of a room full of people who used to bow to her family. She kept her eyes down. She kept her hands folded. She moved along the walls the way servants were taught to move, as if the space belonged to everyone but her. It had not always been this way. Her father, Edmund Hartley, had once held the very title that Percival Ashford now wore, like a coat that fit him too well. Edmund had died when Genevieve was 16, disgraced by accusations of treason and unpaid debt that the county still whispered about at dinner parties. Within a year, the estate, the title, and every possession that had once belonged to the Hartley name had passed to a distant cousin of a rival house, Percival's father. Genevieve had been left with nothing but a trunk of old dresses and a guitar with 2 broken strings that nobody had wanted. She had taken a position in the very house that had swallowed her family's fortune, because a girl with no name and no money did not have many places left to go. Mrs. Pruitt, the housekeeper, had hired her without asking too many questions, and for 6 years, Genevieve had polished silver and carried trays and told herself that surviving quietly was its own kind of victory. Tonight, survival had almost slipped through her fingers. She had only meant to deliver a tray of wine glasses to the west parlor. But the ballroom doors had been open, and the music had pulled her half a step too far, and Duke Percival, flushed with brandy and the attention of 200 guests, had spotted her standing near the dance floor in a gown Mrs. Pruitt had lent her for the evening's serving duties. "Well now," Percival said, loud enough for the nearest guests to turn. "Look who has wandered out of the kitchen and into the ballroom." Genevieve lowered the tray. "Forgive me, Your Grace. I was only passing through." "Passing through," he repeated, and laughed the way men laugh when they know a room is watching them decide something. "You know, I remember when this house had a very different mistress, a very proud one. It is almost funny to see her daughter carrying my wine glasses." A few guests tittered. Lady Beatrice, beside him in ivory silk and diamonds, said nothing, though her eyes flicked toward Genevieve, with something closer to pity than amusement. Percival snapped his fingers at a footman standing near the music stand. "Bring me that old guitar, the one from the storage room. I believe it still has the Hartley crest carved into it." Genevieve's stomach dropped. She knew exactly which guitar he meant. It belonged to her father. When the estate changed hands, most of the Hartley belongings had been sold or burned, but a few odd pieces too worthless to fetch a good price had been shoved into storage and forgotten. The guitar was one of them. 2 of its 6 strings hung loose and curled, useless. The footman returned and placed the instrument in Percival's hands. He turned it over once, smirking, then held it out to Genevieve. "I am told," he said, raising his voice for the benefit of the room, "that the Hartleys were famous, once upon a time, for their musical talent. Your father used to boast about it at every dinner he could not afford to host." He let the guitar dangle from 2 fingers. "So here is my offer, Miss Hartley, since we are all gathered and bored of dancing. If you can play this broken thing well enough to impress my guests, I will marry you right now, this very evening, instead of Lady Beatrice." The room went still enough that Genevieve could hear the candle wax dripping onto the silver trays. "And if I cannot," she said quietly, "Your Grace will have me dismissed." "If you cannot," Percival said, smiling, "you will leave this house tonight and never set foot on Ashford land again. Consider it a fair wager. 2 broken strings against your future. What do you say?" Somewhere behind her, Genevieve heard Mrs. Pruitt draw in a sharp breath. She did not need to turn around to know the housekeeper was silently begging her to apologize and walk away. Genevieve looked at the guitar. She looked at the crest, still faintly visible beneath years of dust, the letter H, carved by her father's own hand, the winter before he died. And for the first time in 6 years, something inside her that had been folded very small began, slowly, to unfold. "I accept your wager, Your Grace," she said. Percival's smile widened. Delighted, the way a man smiles when he believes he has already won. He had no idea that the woman standing before him had spent every night for the past 3 years, learning, in secret, from a teacher whose name the music world had once whispered with reverence. He thought he was watching a servant girl about to be humiliated. He was about to be very wrong. She reached out and took the guitar from his hands. The wood was cool and familiar against her palms, like touching a memory. She ran her thumb over the 2 snapped strings, and for a moment her composure nearly cracked. Because the last time she had held this instrument, her father had still been alive, and the world had still made sense. "I will need a moment to restore it properly," she said. "A performance deserves to be done right, does it not, Your Grace?" Percival waved a hand, amused. "Take your moment. Take all the moments you like. It changes nothing." He turned back to his guests, already laughing with them, already certain of how this evening would end. Genevieve walked toward the edge of the ballroom, guitar cradled against her chest, and did not look back. She did not need to. She could feel his confidence following her like a shadow, and for the first time in a very long while, she was not afraid of it. She had 6 years of silence behind her, and inside the very instrument in her hands, though she did not know it yet, lay the truth that would end everything Percival Ashford had built his life upon. Mrs. Pruitt caught up with her in the corridor outside the alcove, her face pale beneath her cap. "Have you lost your senses entirely? You could have simply apologized, curtsied, said you were overwhelmed by the honor of the evening, and this would already be forgotten. Instead, you have agreed to perform in front of every family with a title in this county. I know exactly what I agreed to, Mrs. Pruitt. Do you? Because from where I am standing, it looks a great deal like a woman about to lose the only roof she has left over her head." Genevieve looked down at the guitar in her arms, at the faint H still visible beneath years of grime, and felt something in her chest settle, rather than tighten, a calm she had not expected, and did not entirely trust yet herself. "My father used to say that a house is not a roof, Mrs. Pruitt. It is the name you are allowed to keep inside it. I gave up the name 6 years ago because I thought that was the price of staying safe. I find, tonight, that I am tired of paying for it." Mrs. Pruitt studied her for a long moment, the sternness in her expression softening into something closer to worry. She had known Genevieve since the girl was 10 years old, back when the manor still belonged to her father, back when Mrs. Pruitt herself had been a junior housemaid, answering to an entirely different family. "Your father was a kind master," she said finally, quietly, glancing over her shoulder to be certain no one else could hear. "Kinder than the one we have now. God forgive me for saying it under his own roof. If there is truth left to find in that old guitar, girl, I hope to heaven you find it before Percival Ashford finds a way to take it from you first." It was the closest thing to an ally's blessing Genevieve had received from anyone inside the house in 6 years, and she carried the warmth of it with her, long after Mrs. Pruitt had hurried off to attend to the abandoned wine trays. She did not sleep that night. She sat instead at the narrow window of her small room beneath the eaves, guitar across her lap, moonlight falling in a pale stripe across the floorboards, and thought of her father's hands on these same strings, of a childhood she had spent years trying not to remember, because remembering hurt more than forgetting ever could. 6 years of practiced numbness, cracked open in a single evening, and underneath it, she found, to her own surprise, not despair, but something closer to relief. She had spent so long being careful. Tonight, for the first time, she had chosen to be brave instead, and the two feelings, she was beginning to understand, were not nearly as similar as she had always assumed. 3 years earlier, on a night much colder than this one, Genevieve had been sent to the wine cellar to fetch a bottle for a guest who had complained the vintage upstairs was not to his liking. She had not expected to find an old man sitting on an overturned crate, humming a tune she recognized from her childhood. His name, she would later learn, was Master Alaric Renard, a groundskeeper who had been hired 2 winters before, under circumstances nobody in the house cared enough to question. He was quiet, kept to himself, and tended the roses along the east wall, with more patience than any of the other staff. What Genevieve had not known, standing frozen at the bottom of the cellar stairs with an empty wine bottle in her hand, was that Alaric Renard had once been the most celebrated guitar teacher in 3 counties, a man whose former students now performed for royalty. He had taught her father, decades ago, before either of them had grown old enough to know how much the world could take from a person. "You hum that song wrong," Alaric had said that night, not looking up. "The 3rd note falls, not rises. Your father always made that mistake too." Genevieve had nearly dropped the bottle. "You knew my father." "I taught your father everything he knew about music," Alaric said, "and judging by the look on your face, you know more than you have let anyone in this house believe." That had been the beginning. 3 nights a week, after the last candle upstairs had been snuffed out, Genevieve slipped down to the cellar with the broken guitar wrapped in an old blanket, and Alaric taught her in whispers, correcting her fingers on the frets by lamplight, telling her stories about her father's youth that she had never been allowed to hear. "Your father was not a traitor," Alaric told her one night, after she had finally learned to coax a full melody out of the instrument, despite its missing strings. "I do not care what the papers said. I knew that man for 40 years. He did not have treason in him. He had enemies who wanted his title more than they wanted the truth." "Then why has no one said so?" Genevieve had asked, her fingers stilling on the frets. Alaric had looked at her for a long moment, his old eyes catching the lamplight. "Because the people who wanted him gone made very certain that anyone who might defend him either stopped believing it or stopped speaking at all." Those words had stayed with Genevieve every night since. She had not understood them fully then. She would understand them fully soon enough. Tonight, standing at the edge of the ballroom with her father's broken guitar in her hands, she thought of Alaric's rose garden, of his patient hands guiding hers over the strings, of every whispered lesson that Percival Ashford did not know had ever happened. She found a quiet alcove behind a velvet curtain and knelt to open the small sewing kit she always carried in her apron pocket, a habit Alaric had taught her, since a musician who could not repair her own instrument was, in his words, only half a musician. She drew out 2 spare strings she had kept hidden there for months, half hoping, half dreading, that a night like this would come. Her hands moved quickly, threading the strings through the pegs, tightening them with the ear she had spent 3 years training. As she worked, she noticed something she had never noticed before. A faint seam along the underside of the guitar's body, just below the bridge, where the wood did not quite match the grain of the rest of the instrument. She pressed her thumb against it. It gave, very slightly, like a hidden hinge. Her breath caught. Whatever this seam meant, it was not something she had time to investigate now, not with 200 guests waiting on the other side of the curtain and a duke certain he had already won his wager. She tucked the thought away, the way she had learned to tuck away every dangerous thing in this house, and finished tuning the final string. Before that, though, in the early months of her lessons, Genevieve had nearly given up more than once. Her fingers had bled against the strings during her second week of practice, and she had sat in the cellar, crying quietly, certain that whatever gift her father possessed had simply skipped over her entirely. Pain in the fingertips means you are doing it correctly, Alaric had told her that night, not unkindly, pressing a cool cloth to her hand. Every musician who has ever mattered has bled for it a little. Your father bled for it too, when he was a boy no older than you are now. He wanted to quit after his first month. His mother would not let him. What was she like? My grandmother. Alaric had smiled. A rare and genuine thing. Fierce. Far fiercer than your father ever let on in polite company. I think you have more of her in you than you know, Genevieve. She used to say that a woman who apologizes for her own talent has already lost half the battle before it begins. Those words had carried her through the following 2 years of lessons, through winters so cold the cellar's stone walls sweated frost, through the constant, exhausting effort of hiding a second life from a household that watched servants far more closely than most servants realized. She had learned not only the guitar, but patience, precision, the particular discipline of a craft that punished shortcuts and rewarded only honest, repeated effort. Alaric never once let her cut a lesson short, even on the nights she arrived exhausted from a full day of scrubbing floors. Talent without discipline is only a rumor of greatness, he told her once. I did not survive 40 years in this profession by being talented. I survived it by refusing to stop showing up. She thought of that lesson now, standing at the edge of the ballroom with the fully restrung guitar in her hands, waiting for her cue. Whatever happened tonight, she was not stepping onto that floor as a frightened servant girl hoping for mercy. She was stepping onto it as her father's daughter, trained by the same hands that had once trained him, and for the first time in years, that thought did not frighten her at all. Somewhere out in the ballroom, the orchestra fell silent. Percival's voice rose above the crowd, calling for her to come forward and honor their bargain. Genevieve rose to her feet, guitar in hand, heart steady, in a way it had not been in 6 years. She was ready. She did not walk back into the ballroom that night, not yet. The moment Percival's voice called for her, Mrs. Pruitt appeared at the curtain, pale and urgent. Miss Hartley, the Duke says he will give you until tomorrow evening if you claim you are not properly dressed for a performance of this size. He wants a spectacle, not a rushed song between wine deliveries. Take the excuse, please. It was, Genevieve realized, the housekeeper's clumsy way of buying her time, of trying to protect her from a public failure that might come from rushing. Genevieve accepted gratefully, sending word through Mrs. Pruitt that she would perform properly at the grand ball planned for the following week, when Percival intended to formally present Lady Beatrice to the county as his bride. Percival, delighted by the idea of a bigger stage for what he assumed would be her humiliation, agreed at once. That gave Genevieve 7 days, and on the very first of those nights, she went straight to the cellar, with the guitar and a small kitchen knife, her hands trembling not from fear, but from a feeling she did not yet have a name for. There is something in the wood, she told Alaric, running her fingers along the seam near the bridge. I felt it while restringing tonight. It should not be here. Alaric took the guitar from her, with the careful reverence of a man handling something sacred. He turned it over under the lamplight, pressed his thumb to the same spot she had found, and went very still. Your father, he said slowly, was a careful man. Careful men leave things where careless men will never think to look. He worked the seam open with patient fingers, and a thin panel of wood lifted away from the underside of the guitar's body, revealing a hollow compartment no wider than a hand. Inside lay a folded stack of papers, yellowed with age, but remarkably preserved, tied together with a faded blue ribbon that Genevieve recognized instantly. It belonged to her mother. Her fingers shook as she untied it. The first page was a letter in her father's own handwriting, dated 3 days before his arrest. If you are reading this, the letter began, then someone has finally found what I hid, and I am no longer alive to explain it myself. I did not commit treason. I discovered that the man who called himself my friend, Charles Ashford, had been forging debts in my name for 2 years, siphoning funds from the estate to cover his own ruinous gambling, and I confronted him with proof. Within a fortnight, I was arrested for the very crimes he committed. I have hidden the true ledgers and his written confession, extracted under circumstances I will not commit to paper, inside this guitar, because I know he will search the house for anything that might expose him, but he will never think to search an old instrument with 2 broken strings. If my daughter Genevieve ever finds this, know that I love her more than any title, and that the truth deserves better than my silence. Find Alaric Renard. He alone knows the whole of it. Genevieve read the letter 3 times before she could speak. Beneath it lay ledgers in a stranger's handwriting, columns of numbers that told the story of a man's debts, quietly transferred onto another man's name, and a final page, a confession, signed with a shaking hand she did not recognize, admitting to the fraud, dated the week before her father's arrest. The signature at the bottom read Charles Ashford, Percival's father. He knew, Genevieve whispered. Percival's father knew my father was innocent. He let him hang for it anyway. Alaric set the guitar down gently on the crate beside him, his weathered face carrying an old grief that Genevieve had never fully understood until this moment. I was there the week your father died, he said quietly. I tried to bring this forward myself. Once, years ago, I went to the magistrate. I was told a groundskeeper's word meant nothing against a duke's family, and that if I valued my position, I would forget I had ever spoken to Edmund Hartley at all. He looked up at her. I took that position at this house on purpose, Genevieve. I have been waiting 3 years for someone with the right name and the right courage to finish what I could not. Genevieve folded the papers back into their ribbon, with hands that had finally stopped shaking, replaced by something far steadier. Then we will finish it together, she said. At the ball, in front of everyone. Alaric studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Your father always said, music could carry a truth that words alone could not. Perhaps it is time we proved him right. That night, Genevieve could not bring herself to return immediately to her small room beneath the eaves. She walked instead, along the edge of the rose garden Alaric tended so faithfully, the folded papers tucked safely inside her apron, the cold air biting at her cheeks, in a way that felt almost welcome, almost clarifying. 6 years later, she had told herself a version of her family's story that made the pain bearable. Her father had been foolish with money. Her father had trusted the wrong people. Her father had brought ruin on his own household through carelessness she had never quite been able to name, and she had built her survival on quietly accepting a shame that was never truly hers to carry. Now she understood the shame belonged entirely to someone else, and the understanding did not feel like the relief she might have expected. It felt like grief arriving 6 years late, finally given permission to be exactly as large as it had always deserved to be. She sat on the low stone bench near the roses and allowed herself, for the first time since the funeral, to cry, without trying to stop it, without worrying whether anyone might see. When the tears finally passed, something had shifted underneath them, quiet and permanent. She was no longer a girl mourning a shameful memory. She was a woman preparing to demand justice for a stolen one, and there was a considerable difference between the 2 kinds of grief. Word of a hidden confession is a dangerous thing to carry alone, and Genevieve knew it. A servant girl accusing a duke's dead father of fraud, with nothing but old papers and an unnamed groundskeeper as a witness, could easily be dismissed, or worse, quietly disappeared before she ever reached the ballroom floor. She needed more than papers. She needed people the county would actually believe. Alaric, it turned out, had been building exactly that for longer than Genevieve realized. Over the following days, he introduced her, carefully and always under cover of darkness, to 2 people whose testimony could not be so easily waved away. The first was Mr. Josiah Whitfield, the estate's aging solicitor, who had drafted the original transfer of the Hartley title to the Ashford family 6 years earlier, and who had never quite believed the paperwork he had been asked to sign. He had kept his own copy of certain documents, quietly, out of a lawyer's habit of trusting nothing fully. "I always thought the timing was strange," Whitfield admitted, "when Alaric brought Genevieve to his modest cottage on the edge of the estate. Your father's arrest came 4 days after he requested an audit of the estate accounts. I drew up the audit request myself. I never understood why it never happened." It was in Whitfield's cluttered study, surrounded by towers of yellowed legal folders, that Genevieve first met the old solicitor's nephew, a young man named Nathaniel Cross, who had come from London some months earlier to assist his uncle with the estate's growing paperwork while he studied for the bar. He rose when she entered, nearly upsetting a stack of ledgers in his haste, and there was an earnestness in the gesture that Genevieve found, against her better judgment, rather endearing. "Miss Hartley," he said, recovering himself and offering a small bow. "My uncle has spoken of little else for a week. I confess I did not expect the woman at the center of it to walk in looking quite so composed. I believe I would be considerably less calm in your position." "I have had 6 years of practice at appearing calm, Mr. Cross," Genevieve said. "It is mostly a performance, rather like the one I am preparing for the ball." "Then I hope you will allow me to help you prepare for both," Nathaniel said, and there was something in the directness of his offer, unshielded by the careful flattery she had come to expect from young men of his station, that made her look at him a moment longer than strictly necessary. Over the following days, Nathaniel proved himself useful in ways that went well beyond politeness. He combed through his uncle's older files late into the night, cross-referencing dates and signatures, until he found a second copy of the original audit request Whitfield had drawn up 6 years earlier, a copy that had somehow never made its way into the estate's official records, likely removed deliberately at the time. He rode into the county seat twice on Genevieve's behalf to quietly confirm the identity of the assembly representative Beatrice's father intended to send, ensuring the man's presence at the ball could not later be dismissed as a convenient fiction. "You did not have to involve yourself this deeply," Genevieve told him. The third evening he arrived at the cottage with fresh documents and ink-stained fingers. "This is not your family's ruin to correct." "No," Nathaniel agreed, "but I have spent 2 years watching my uncle carry the guilt of papers he was pressured to sign, without being permitted to ask questions. I would like, for once, to be part of setting something right, instead of simply recording how it went wrong." He paused, glancing at her with an expression that seemed to cost him some effort to keep light. "And I confess, Miss Hartley, I find myself rather invested in seeing you succeed, for reasons that have very little to do with paperwork." Genevieve felt warmth rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in Whitfield's small hearth. That is a bold thing to say to a woman who does not yet know whether she will have a name worth attaching to by the end of the week. "I did not ask about your name, Miss Hartley," Nathaniel said quietly. "I asked about you." The second was Lady Beatrice Wren herself. This was the alliance that surprised Genevieve most. She had expected Percival's own bride to be her enemy, or at best, indifferent to whatever fate awaited a servant girl at her engagement ball. Instead, when Alaric arranged a quiet meeting in the rose garden under the excuse of discussing flower arrangements, Lady Beatrice listened to Genevieve's story with an expression that shifted slowly from polite curiosity to genuine alarm.
"He has already spent nearly half of my dowry,"
Beatrice admitted quietly, twisting a glove in her hands. "I did not want to believe the rumors about his debts, but I have seen the letters from his creditors. I agreed to marry him because my family insisted a title mattered more than character. I am beginning to think my family was wrong." "I am not asking you to betray him publicly before you are ready," Genevieve said. "I am only asking that when the truth is spoken, you do not stand beside him and pretend you never heard it." Beatrice was quiet for a long moment, looking out over the roses Alaric tended so carefully. "My father built his fortune from nothing," she said finally. "He always told me a woman should never marry a man whose foundation she has not personally inspected. I think it is time I inspected mine." She met Genevieve's eyes. "I will not stand beside him, Miss Hartley. Whatever the truth turns out to be, I will not stand beside a lie." That night, walking back to the servants' quarters with Alaric at her side, Genevieve allowed herself, for the first time in years, to feel something close to hope. "You have built more allies in a week than my father managed in his final year," she told Alaric. "Your father did not have a week," Alaric replied gently. "He had 4 days between the audit request and his arrest. Percival's family has had 6 years to make certain no one asked questions. You are doing something braver than he ever had the chance to do." Genevieve looked back toward the manor house, its windows glowing gold against the dark. Percival's laughter still faintly audible from an open window where he entertained late guests, utterly unaware that the ground beneath his title had already begun to shift. "6 more days," she said quietly. "6 more days," Alaric agreed. "Then we let the music speak." Nathaniel walked her partway back toward the manor that night, keeping a respectful distance beneath the bare branches lining the drive, though neither of them seemed in any particular hurry to close it. "May I call on you again, once this business with the ball is settled?" he asked, as the manor's lit windows came into view. "Whatever the outcome, Duchess or dismissed servant, I find I would like to know you either way. You may find, Mr. Cross, that neither of those titles suits me especially well. Then I shall simply call on Genevieve Hartley," he said, "and let her decide for herself what she would like to be called." He bowed once, formally, though his eyes carried none of the formality his posture suggested, and turned back toward his uncle's cottage, leaving Genevieve standing alone in the cold with a smile she could not quite explain away as relief over the plan alone. Percival Ashford had built his entire life on the comfortable belief that people who had lost everything eventually learned to stay small. He had grown up watching his father humiliate lesser men at dinner parties, and had absorbed, without ever questioning it, the idea that power was simply what remained after everyone weaker had been pushed aside. So it unsettled him, in ways he could not quite name, when Genevieve Hartley stopped flinching. It began with small things. She no longer lowered her eyes quite so quickly when he passed her in the hall. When he made an offhand joke at her expense during a family dinner, she met it with a calm, polite silence, instead of the wounded retreat he had come to expect. Once, he caught her speaking quietly with Lady Beatrice near the garden, and when he asked what they had discussed, Beatrice had simply said, "Flowers," in a tone that made him feel, absurdly, like a child who had been told to mind his own affairs. "There is something different about that girl," he told his valet, a thin, nervous man named Corbin, while dressing for dinner 4 nights before the ball. "She used to look at the floor when I spoke to her. Now she looks at me as though she is waiting for something." "Perhaps she is simply preparing for the performance, Your Grace," Corbin offered. "You did make her a rather public wager." Percival waved a dismissive hand. "It was a joke. Everyone understood it was a joke. She cannot possibly still be planning to attempt it." But some old, uneasy instinct, the same one that had once warned his father when the estate's finances began to fray at the edges, told Percival otherwise. He found himself watching Genevieve more closely than he cared to admit, noting the way she disappeared toward the servants' cellar 3 nights out of every week, the way the old groundskeeper Renard seemed to linger near her whenever their paths crossed, the way Josiah Whitfield, a solicitor he had not summoned in over a year, had been seen walking the estate grounds twice in recent days. He summoned Mrs. Pruitt to his study on the 4th evening. "What does the Hartley girl do in her free hours?" he asked, not looking up from the ledger on his desk, a ledger that, had he examined it more honestly, would have told him precisely how little time remained before his creditors stopped accepting excuses. Mrs. Pruitt, loyal to the house out of habit rather than affection for its master, chose her words with care. "She keeps to herself, Your Grace, as all good servants should." "She keeps to herself in the wine cellar 3 times a week," Percival said. "I am not a fool, Mrs. Pruitt, whatever this house may whisper about me." Mrs. Pruitt said nothing, and her silence told him more than any answer could have. That night, alone in his study with a glass of brandy he could no longer afford, Percival Ashford allowed himself, for the first time in years, a flicker of genuine fear. It was not fear of Genevieve Hartley herself. It was fear of the version of his father's history he had never once allowed himself to examine too closely, the quiet understanding, buried since childhood, that the title he wore had not come to his family through entirely honest means. He poured another glass and told himself, the way he had told himself 100 times before, that whatever his father may have done, the past could not touch a man who refused to look at it. He did not yet know that his father's past had already climbed out of a guitar's hollow body and found itself a very determined voice. Percival's unease did not stay contained to his own study for long. The following afternoon, he rode unannounced to Josiah Whitfield's cottage under the pretense of discussing an unrelated matter of estate business, hoping to gauge, through idle conversation, whether the old solicitor knew anything of substance. He found Nathaniel there instead, alone at his uncle's writing desk, quickly covering a stack of papers with a blank sheet the moment the Duke's carriage was heard on the gravel outside. "Your Grace," Nathaniel said, rising with a composure that had clearly been rehearsed for exactly this possibility. "My uncle has ridden into the county seat this morning. Might I be of some assistance?" "I was not aware Whitfield had taken on an assistant," Percival said, his eyes moving deliberately across the desk, though Nathaniel had already tucked the sensitive documents into a drawer. "You are new to the county, I think." "Only these past few months, Your Grace. I am studying for the bar and assisting my uncle with his correspondence in the meantime." How industrious. Percival's tone carried the false warmth of a man testing for weakness. "I hope your uncle is not filling your head with old gossip about my family." Country solicitors do love a good scandal to embellish their supper conversation. "I find scandal considerably less interesting than accurate paperwork, Your Grace," Nathaniel said evenly. "My uncle has taught me that a properly kept ledger tells a far more reliable story than any rumor ever could." Percival left the cottage some minutes later, without having learned anything of use, though the calm precision of the young clerk's answers troubled him more than an obvious lie would have. He was, he realized with growing discomfort, no longer certain how many people in this county had quietly begun working against him, or for how long they had been doing it. That evening, unable to settle, he summoned Lady Beatrice to the drawing-room, hoping to reassure himself through her presence that at least one alliance in his life remained solid. "You have been unusually quiet this week," he said, pouring her a glass of sherry she did not ask for. "I trust nothing troubles you. I have simply been thinking about the sort of household I wish to build, Your Grace," Beatrice replied, accepting the glass but not drinking from it. "A woman is permitted to think carefully before she commits herself to a lifetime." "And what conclusions has your thinking produced?" Beatrice met his eyes with a steadiness that unsettled him more than he cared to admit. "That I have not yet decided, Your Grace. I find I am waiting for the ball to tell me something I do not yet know." Percival laughed, though the sound came out thinner than he intended, and changed the subject to safer matters, unaware that his bride-to-be had already begun rehearsing, quietly, the exact words she would use to leave him. The 7 days passed, the way important days always do, both too slowly and far too quickly at once. Genevieve spent her mornings performing her ordinary duties with the same quiet discipline she always had, careful not to give Percival any further reason for suspicion. But her evenings belonged entirely to preparation, and each one brought her closer to a moment she had spent 6 years believing would never come. Alaric drilled her relentlessly on the melody itself, a composition her father had written when Genevieve was a child, one he had always called the Heartly Truth, as a private joke between himself and Alaric, never imagining it would one day carry his actual truth into a ballroom full of witnesses. "The song alone will move people," Alaric told her, "but a song is not evidence. You must be ready to speak the moment the final note fades, before anyone has time to recover their composure and dismiss what they have just heard." Whitfield, for his part, prepared the paperwork that would matter most in the cold light of law, rather than emotion. He drew up a formal petition for the reopening of Edmund Hartley's case, citing the newly discovered confession and ledgers as grounds, ready to be presented to the county magistrate the very morning after the ball, before Percival's family could destroy or hide anything further. "A confession is powerful," Whitfield explained to Genevieve over tea in his cottage, "but confessions can be challenged as forgeries by a family with enough money for lawyers of their own. What we need is a witness willing to speak against them in the moment, while emotions and public attention make it impossible to quietly bury the matter afterward. That witness, they all understood without needing to say it aloud, would have to be Alaric. "I have hidden behind rose bushes for 3 years," Alaric said quietly, the night before the ball, as he helped Genevieve restring the guitar one final time. "I told myself I was protecting you by staying out of sight until you were ready. The truth is, I was also protecting myself. I have not spoken your father's name in public since the week he died, because the last time I tried, it cost me nearly everything I had left." "You do not have to speak if you are not ready," Genevieve said gently. Alaric shook his head, his old hands surprisingly steady on the guitar's tuning pegs. "Your father gave me 40 years of friendship before he gave me a single reason to doubt him. I owe him more than my comfort. Tomorrow, I will finally pay that debt." Lady Beatrice, meanwhile, quietly informed her own father, a merchant of considerable standing in London, of what she had learned, without revealing the full plan. Her father, a practical man who valued his daughter's reputation above any title, arranged, without Percival's knowledge, for a representative of the county's Assembly of Peers to attend the ball as an unannounced guest, a formality Beatrice's family had every right to request for an engagement of such significance. By the night before the ball, every piece Genevieve needed had, quietly and carefully, moved into place. Nathaniel found her in the rose garden that same evening, having ridden over under the excuse of delivering Whitfield's final petition draft for her approval. He found her instead sitting very still on the low stone bench, the folded pages of her father's confession pressed against her chest, like something she was afraid to set down. "You look as though you are saying goodbye to something," he said quietly, settling beside her without asking permission, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "I am saying goodbye to the version of myself who believed she deserved to disappear," Genevieve said. "It is strange. I thought I would feel only anger tonight. Instead, I mostly feel tired and a little afraid, and considerably less alone than I expected to feel." "You are not alone," Nathaniel said. "Whatever tomorrow brings, you have not been alone in this for some time now." She turned to look at him, and in the low lantern light spilling from the cottage window behind them, she found his expression far softer than the careful, professional composure he wore in front of his uncle. "You have given up a great deal of sleep this past week, for a woman you barely know, Mr. Cross." "I have given up a great deal of sleep," he agreed, "because I have found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I would rather spend my nights helping the right kind of person win a fight worth winning, than spend them comfortably asleep, pretending the fight was not mine to care about." He reached out, slowly, and took her hand where it rested on the folded papers, not pulling it away, simply holding it, warm and steady against the cold evening air. Genevieve did not draw back. "Whatever I am tomorrow," she said softly, "Duchess, or dismissed, or something in between that has not yet been invented, I find I would like you to still be standing somewhere nearby when it happens." "Then I shall make certain to be exactly there," Nathaniel said, and for a long, quiet moment, neither of them said anything further at all, content simply to sit together beneath a garden Alaric had spent 3 years tending in secret. Two people who had found each other in the middle of someone else's ruin and discovered, unexpectedly, something worth keeping for themselves. Eventually he rose, pressed a light, careful kiss to the back of her hand in the old-fashioned way his uncle had taught him, and took his leave, promising to be present at the ball the following evening, seated near his uncle, ready to help however the night required. Genevieve returned to the cellar afterward and sat alone with the restrung guitar resting across her lap, and allowed herself, finally, to grieve properly for the father she had spent 6 years mourning in silence. "Tomorrow," she whispered to the empty cellar, "I will finish what you started." The guitar, as if it understood, held its tune perfectly. Percival Ashford was not a man who solved problems through patience. He solved them, as his father had taught him, through pressure applied quickly and quietly before a situation had the chance to grow beyond his control. 2 nights before the ball, unable to shake the unease that had settled over him since his conversation with Mrs. Pruitt, He made a decision he would later come to regret more than almost any other in his life. He would simply remove the guitar. It seemed, to his mind, an elegant solution. Without the instrument, Genevieve could not perform. Without a performance, whatever plan she and her strange collection of allies had been quietly building would collapse before it ever reached the ballroom floor. He could publicly declare, with theatrical regret, that the wager had been a joke all along, dismiss her from the household the following morning, and be married to Lady Beatrice within the month, with nothing left to threaten him. He sent Corbin to search the servants' quarters while Genevieve was occupied with evening duties, but the guitar was not there. He sent him next to the cellar, but Alaric, who had begun sleeping in a small storage room adjoining it out of quiet vigilance, intercepted the valet before he reached the instrument's hiding place behind a false panel in the wine racks, a trick Alaric had learned decades ago from Edmund Hartley himself, who had always kept his most treasured possessions exactly where careless men would never think to look. "Looking for something, Mr. Corbin?" Alaric asked, stepping out of the shadows with a lantern raised just enough to make the valet startle. "The Duke wishes to inspect the instrument before the performance," Corbin said, recovering his composure poorly, "to ensure it is suitable." "How thoughtful of him," Alaric replied, his voice carrying just enough dry amusement to make Corbin visibly uncomfortable. "Tell His Grace the instrument is being cared for exactly as it should be, and that Miss Hartley intends to honor their wager precisely as agreed. Tell him also that a man who tries to steal a woman's instrument 2 nights before a public wager tends to raise far more questions than he answers." Corbin left without the guitar, and Percival, upon hearing the report, understood with a cold, sinking clarity that his simplest solution had already failed, and that failing it publicly, or attempting anything more drastic, risked exposing exactly the kind of desperation that would make every whispered rumor about his family's finances suddenly seem far more credible. He tried one more approach the following evening, cornering Genevieve herself in the narrow hallway outside the kitchen. "You could still withdraw," he said, his voice low, almost gentle, the tone of a man trying persuasion instead of force. "I would forget the wager entirely. No dismissal. You could stay in this house, comfortable, safe, exactly as you are now, and none of this would need to happen." "Safe," Genevieve repeated quietly, "has meant unseen for 6 years, Your Grace. I find I no longer want to be safe in that particular way." "You do not know what you are risking," Percival said, and for a moment something almost like genuine warning flickered behind his eyes, an admission, however small, that he understood exactly how much truth the guitar might carry. "Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed again. I am counting on it," Genevieve said, and walked past him toward the kitchen without waiting for a response. Percival stood alone in the narrow hallway for a long moment afterward, the candle above him guttering in a draught from an open window, and felt, for the first time since his father's death, a cold, uneasy suspicion that the ground beneath him had already begun to give way, though he could not yet see the crack. He had one day left to stop her, and he had run out of quiet solutions. The night of the ball arrived, dressed in more candlelight than Stirling Manor had seen in a decade. Every family of consequence in the county had answered the invitation, drawn as much by curiosity about the strange wager that had apparently become the talk of every drawing room for a week, as by genuine goodwill toward the engagement itself. Percival, sensing the shift in his guests' attention, had spent the morning rehearsing a speech designed to reframe the entire affair as a charming jest, a duke's playful gesture toward a humble servant girl, nothing more. Genevieve dressed that evening not in a borrowed gown, but in a simple dress of deep blue that Lady Beatrice had quietly sent to her chambers that afternoon, along with a short note that read only, "Wear this. You should not have to borrow anything else in this house, ever again." Alaric waited for her outside the ballroom doors, dressed more formally than Genevieve had ever seen him, his groundskeeper's coat exchanged for a plain but respectable suit that Whitfield had lent him for the occasion. "Are you frightened?" Alaric asked quietly. "Yes," Genevieve admitted, "but I have been frightened for 6 years, Alaric. Tonight, I would rather be frightened while doing something than frightened while doing nothing. The ballroom itself seemed to hum with an energy Genevieve had never felt in it before, even during her own family's finest years in this house. Every chandelier had been lit to its fullest, throwing warm gold light across gowns of silk and satin in every shade the county's dressmakers could produce. The orchestra's final notes drifted towards silence as footmen moved discreetly along the walls, refreshing glasses, and somewhere beneath the noise of 200 private conversations, Genevieve could feel the particular electricity of a crowd that sensed, without quite knowing why, that tonight would be remembered. Nathaniel stood near his uncle, at the edge of the room, dressed more finely than she had yet seen him, and when their eyes met across the crowded floor, he offered the smallest, steadiest nod, a promise that he was exactly where he said he would be. Inside, Josiah Whitfield had positioned himself near the edge of the room, beside a gentleman Genevieve did not recognize, an older man in formal county attire, whom Beatrice had introduced only as a family friend attending on my father's behalf, though Genevieve understood, from Whitfield's earlier explanation, that this quiet observer represented the county's assembly of peers, present to witness whatever unfolded, with an authority that could not be easily dismissed the following morning. Percival took his position at the center of the ballroom as the orchestra finished its final piece before the appointed hour, Lady Beatrice at his side in white silk, her expression composed and unreadable to anyone who did not know, as Genevieve now did, precisely what she had chosen that evening. "My friends," Percival announced, raising a glass, his voice carrying the practiced warmth of a man accustomed to commanding a room. "Some of you may have heard whispers of a small wager I made in jest last week with a member of my household staff. I confess, I had nearly forgotten the matter entirely, and I am sure Miss Hartley will forgive me if we set the jest aside tonight in favor of properly celebrating my engagement to the remarkable Lady Beatrice." A ripple of polite laughter moved through the crowd, exactly as Percival had hoped. But Genevieve stepped forward from the edge of the room, guitar in hand, and the laughter faltered into an uncertain hush. "Your Grace made me a promise, in front of 200 witnesses," she said, her voice steady, carrying clearly across the marble floor, in a way that surprised even her. "I have spent the past week preparing to honor it properly. I would hate for anyone here to think Hartley does not keep her word, even when a duke seems eager to forget his own." A murmur of interest swept the room. Percival's smile remained fixed in place, but Genevieve could see, in the tightness around his eyes, that he understood he had lost the ability to dismiss her gracefully in front of an audience that now very much wanted to see what would happen next. "Very well," he said, forcing lightness into his tone. "Far be it from me to disappoint a room so eager for entertainment. Play your song, Miss Hartley." Genevieve walked to the center of the floor, where the orchestra had been standing moments before, the guitar cradled against her. 6 years of silence gathered behind her, like a held breath finally about to be released. She looked once toward Alaric, who gave her the smallest nod. She looked once toward Lady Beatrice, who lifted her chin in quiet solidarity. She looked, finally, toward the unfamiliar gentleman from the county assembly, and understood that whatever happened in the next few minutes would not simply vanish into gossip by morning. She placed her fingers on the strings. The room fell utterly silent. The first notes were soft, almost hesitant, the way her father had always begun this particular melody, and for a moment, Genevieve was not standing in a ballroom full of strangers at all. She was 6 years old again, sitting on the floor of her father's study while he played this very tune by the fire, humming along in a voice too big for the small room. The melody built slowly, deliberately, each phrase folding into the next, with the patient inevitability of a story that had been waiting a very long time to be told. Genevieve had not simply memorized the song, she had lived inside it for 3 years of secret lessons, and now, standing in the very house that had stolen her family's name, she let every note carry the weight of everything she had never been allowed to say aloud. When the melody reached its center, she began to sing, softly at first, words her father had written into the song long before Genevieve was born. A simple verse about a man who trusted a friend and paid for that trust with everything he had. The ballroom, which had begun the performance in polite, expectant silence, shifted slowly into something closer to reverence. Even those guests who had come only for gossip found themselves leaning forward, caught by a voice that carried genuine grief rather than performance. A song that felt unmistakably true. Percival stood frozen at the edge of the dance floor, his practiced smile long since abandoned, watching a servant girl transform, note by note, into someone he no longer recognized and could not dismiss. As the final verse approached, Genevieve let the music soften until only a single, sustained note remained, and into that silence she spoke, her voice carrying easily across the stilled room. This song was written by my father, Edmund Hartley, the true duke of this estate, 6 years before he was hanged for a crime he did not commit. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Percival took a step forward, opening his mouth to object, but the gentleman from the county assembly raised a single hand, a small, quiet gesture that nonetheless carried enough authority to still him. "Let her finish, Your Grace," the man said calmly. "I believe we would all like to hear the rest." Genevieve set the guitar gently on a nearby table and drew from beneath her shawl the folded papers Alaric had helped her wrap carefully in oilcloth. That very afternoon, my father discovered that his closest friend, Charles Ashford, had been forging debts in his name to cover his own ruinous gambling. When my father confronted him with proof, he was arrested for treason within a fortnight, on charges that Charles Ashford himself had quietly arranged. Before he died, my father hid the true ledgers and a written confession signed by Charles Ashford inside this very guitar, the same guitar Duke Percival gave me a week ago as a mockery, never imagining it held the very evidence that would prove his own father's guilt. She held the papers aloft, and Whitfield stepped forward from the crowd to take them, his solicitor's voice carrying clear as he confirmed the authenticity of the ledgers and the confession's handwriting against documents he had kept from his own original records 6 years earlier. "I can attest," Alaric said, stepping forward himself for the first time in 3 years of careful hiding, his voice trembling only slightly, "that I was Edmund Hartley's closest friend and teacher, and that in the final week of his life he told me precisely what I have just heard confirmed tonight. I did not speak sooner, because I was told, quite plainly, that a groundskeeper's word meant nothing against a duke's family. I hope tonight proves that assessment was wrong." Percival's face had gone the color of old ash. "This is a fabrication," he said, though his voice had lost the commanding warmth it carried only minutes before. "Forged documents, a servant girl's fantasy, and an old man's grudge. The handwriting has already been confirmed against your father's original correspondence in my files, Your Grace," Whitfield said quietly. The gentleman from the county assembly stepped forward at last, his expression grave. "I came here tonight as a formality, Your Grace, at the request of Lady Beatrice's family, who wished a representative present for an engagement of this significance. I did not expect to witness a confession of inherited fraud. I'm afraid this matter can no longer remain a private affair between two families. It will require a full inquiry, beginning tomorrow morning." Lady Beatrice stepped away from Percival's side, quietly, deliberately, and crossed the floor to stand beside Genevieve instead. "I withdraw my engagement, effective immediately," she said, loud enough for the entire room to hear. "I will not stand beside a man who built his comfort on another family's ruin." The room, which had begun the evening in celebration of Percival Ashford's future, ended it instead in stunned witness to his unraveling, and Genevieve Hartley stood at the center of it all, guitar silent beside her. 6 years of stolen truth, finally spoken aloud in the one room that had refused, for so long, to hear it. The inquiry that followed took the better part of 2 months, but its conclusion, once the ledgers, the confession, and Whitfield's original records were laid before the county magistrate, surprised no one who had stood in that ballroom the night the truth finally spoke for itself. Charles Ashford's fraud was confirmed beyond reasonable doubt. Edmund Hartley's name was formally cleared, posthumously restored to honor, by a ruling that, while it could not return him to life, returned to his daughter everything that had once carried his name. The Hartley title and the estate itself, having been obtained through provable fraud, were restored to Genevieve as Edmund's sole surviving heir. Percival Ashford, stripped of both title and fortune, left the county quietly within the month, his creditors finally catching up to debts he could no longer disguise behind a duke's coat. Genevieve, when asked by the magistrate whether she wished to pursue further punishment against him personally, declined. "My father spent his final days more concerned with the truth than with revenge," she said. "I would rather honor that part of him than the part of Percival Ashford that wanted only to punish me for existing." She did not marry him, of course. There had never truly been a wager worth winning in that particular sense, only a truth that needed a stage large enough to be heard. Percival's proposal, made in mockery, had never been anything Genevieve wanted, and its collapse cost her nothing she had not already learned to live without. What she gained instead surprised her more than the title itself. Alaric Renard stayed on at Stirling Manor, no longer hiding behind a groundskeeper's coat, formally welcomed as the household's honored guest, and, at Genevieve's insistence, as the estate's newly appointed master of music, a position she created specifically so the county's children, regardless of their family's fortune, could learn an instrument the way her father once had. Josiah Whitfield became the estate's permanent solicitor, a role he approached for the first time in years without the quiet unease of a man signing papers he did not fully believe. Lady Beatrice, whose courage in stepping away from Percival had cost her a title but earned her something Genevieve suspected she valued far more, remained a close friend, visiting often, the two women bonding over a shared understanding of how much strength it took to walk away from a comfortable lie. Nathaniel Cross, once his uncle's clerk, was called to the bar within the year and opened a modest practice in the county seat, though he found reasons to ride out to Stirling Manor with a frequency that made his uncle smile knowingly every time the young man reached for his coat. He and Genevieve took their time, neither wanting to build something new on the hurried foundation of a single dramatic evening, and it was nearly a year after the ball, on a quiet spring afternoon, in the very rose garden Alaric had tended in secret for so long, that Nathaniel asked her, with far less composure than he usually managed, whether she might consider making his modest household considerably less modest by joining it permanently. "You do realize," Genevieve said, laughing despite the sudden unsteadiness in her own voice, "that I already have a house rather larger than yours." "I am aware," Nathaniel said. "I am not asking you to abandon your house, Genevieve. I am asking you to let me spend the rest of my life standing beside you in it, the way I found I rather liked doing during the worst week either of us had ever lived through." She said yes before he had entirely finished the sentence, and Alaric, who had been pretending very unconvincingly to prune roses within earshot the entire time, did not even attempt to hide his satisfied smile. On the first anniversary of that ballroom performance, Genevieve stood once more in the same hall, though this time surrounded by children from the county's poorest families, gathered for their first music lesson under Alaric's patient instruction. She held her father's guitar, fully restored now, its strings replaced, its hidden compartment sealed with quiet reverence, rather than secrecy. "My father used to say," she told the children gathered around her, "that the truth hidden does not disappear. It only waits, patiently, for someone brave enough to let it be heard." She began to play the same melody that had once silenced an entire ballroom, and this time there was no mockery waiting at the end of it, no wager, no threat, only music, finally free to be exactly what her father had always meant it to be. If there is one thing tonight's story leaves behind, gentle viewers, let it be this: the people who try hardest to keep us small often do so because they are afraid of exactly how much we are capable of becoming once we stop believing them. Genevieve Hartley spent 6 years being told she was nothing. She discovered, in the end, that she had simply been waiting for the right moment to prove otherwise. If this story moved you, subscribe to see how many more journeys like hers we uncover together. And leave a comment below telling us where in the world you are watching from tonight. I would love to say hello to you personally, just to know how far our story has traveled to reach you. Consider for a moment how many quiet rooms in your own life might be holding a truth that simply has not found its stage yet. Consider how many people you may have underestimated, or how many times you yourself have been the one quietly underestimated by someone too comfortable in their own certainty to look closer. Genevieve Hartley did not win her family's name back through anger, though she had every right to feel it. She won it back through patience, through discipline, through the slow, unglamorous work of showing up night after night to practice a craft nobody was watching her perfect, until the one night the whole world finally was. That, perhaps, is the quieter lesson tucked inside tonight's story. Justice rarely arrives the moment we want it to. It arrives instead in the evening. We are finally ready to receive it properly, having done the work in private that makes the public moment possible. Alaric Renard waited 3 years in a rose garden for that evening. Genevieve waited 6. Neither of them wasted the waiting. They spent it becoming exactly the kind of people the truth could safely be handed to. If this story moved you, subscribe to see how many more journeys like hers we uncover together, and leave a comment below telling us where in the world you are watching from tonight. I would love to say hello to you personally, just to know how far our story has traveled to reach you. Until next time, gentle viewers, take care of one another, and never let anyone convince you that your truth is not worth the wait.